no doubt howls at the gate of the Duke who opens Parliament's Park, whose paling prongs are high and sharp, whose thistles are official, making little oval beds. They give his grace, and yes, we minded our conscription less when an average man would call upon our beauty. Hi, my name's Duncan Montgomery. I'm a printmaker specialising in wood engraving, and I'm in the Jackson studio in London to talk a bit about my practice and my process. I did a degree in English literature before I started wood engraving, so the interest in literature probably came slightly before my interest in art. Early modern print culture was what I studied mostly at universities, and I was particularly interested in how the books of the 16th and 17th centuries were produced, and particularly the illustrated books. I spent quite a lot of time in rare books rooms and so on, pulling up printed books and manuscripts. So I haven't done that many courses. The first move that I did was I looked up what you needed to start, and I bought a book by Simon Brett, which is called Wood Engraving: How to Do It, and it really got me going. So I basically taught myself through trial and error, which I think is on some level probably the only way you can do it. You can go to courses, and I've since attended courses to work on specific aspects of my skills, so printing, for example. But ultimately, there's no sort of schooling that is a replacement for just doing it, making the mistake, not making it again. The engagement that you get when you're drawing something for the fifth or sixth time, finally transferring it to the block, engraving it very precisely over 5 or 6 days, you engage with the subject matter on quite a deep level, and I always find that really rewarding. I'm working out of my home because wood engraving is, although it is printmaking, it's relatively clean. You don't need a lot of gear really. So I just have my reference images or drawings around me, a block in front of me on a sandbag, and I'm just sat at a desk, which is also a standing desk for kind of comfort, because the sessions can be quite long. I can be working for 8 or 10 hours quite easily. Most of the engravings I've worked on are relatively small. I'm quite into the detail and some forms of art like illustration or bookplate work, where you don't necessarily go to the biggest poster level format, because wood engravings are so detailed, and because generally you spent quite a lot of time refining the image and making it as crisp and bold as you can. They tend to work quite well for branding purposes or for the cover of products and stuff like that. I've worked on wedding invites, CD covers, and kind of album covers, that kind of thing. There's really quite a lot you can do. So it's quite versatile from that perspective. Some of the projects that I do are quite long term. So currently I'm working on a project about the history of cold water swimming in England with a cultural historian, and we've been working together for 2 years or so, making prints on that theme, drawing on lots of different kind of archive material and mixing that up with photos and drawings from our own trip swimming. We've used all sorts of visual kind of prompts for that, so everything from strong arming my friends into modeling to books of Victorian photographs or maps or plans. One thing that I do really enjoy in the project that I'm currently doing on open water swimming in England is that it's figurative and it includes people. And I actually think wood engraving is great for figurative work. So I've really tried to do as much of that as I can. Another example of a print that had quite a lot of research behind it. For example, I'm working on a book plate at the moment which has various different motifs on it, some of which are drawn from William Morris books and wallpapers and so on, and also the copperplate map of London. I've drawn some of the motifs in that print from those sources, and I'm kind of working them into a single bookplate for an institution. In terms of planning images, I tend to do quite a lot of drawing, particularly composition is obviously always a challenge, and you're generally working within quite a small area where you've got a block a certain size and you need to make everything fit and use the block well. So it tends to be 4 or 5 versions of a design drawn out. Once I've settled on a composition that I like, and I've got a toned drawing to remind me of the relative tone in the image. I'll trace that, and often I'll actually just cut out the tracing so that I have a traced outline of the major objects or areas of the image, and then I'll just draw around that. Sketchbooks are a part of my practice, definitely, as are kind of reference photos and historical material that I might be referencing in the image. I don't have a single sketchbook that I fill with all of my kind of drawing. I tend to keep it in my head, and then once I have decided on a particular image, I'll then work up that image in isolation on a large sheet of watercolor paper. When you're working from old photographs, particularly kind of Victorian and 19th century photographs, it's a strange thought to think that someone sat in the same place for 30 seconds in the 19th century and that act has some kind of echo in art in the present day. I find that somehow quite satisfying. I just like the idea that those images have an afterlife. Yeah, it's quite a rich visual resource to draw on. 16th and 17th centuries, that's really before wood engraving was commonly practiced. Most illustrated books in that era had either copperplate engravings or type ornament or woodcuts. It's not until the late 18th century really that people start to do wood engravings as opposed to woodcuts or other printmaking forms for illustrated books, and it's really a mass production art at that stage because you can print thousands and thousands of times from an engraved wood block. I think the thing that really got me quite excited about making prints and letterpress printing generally, even though I'm far from a letterpress printer, was the fact that the books of the 16th and 17th century, they're printed on quite shoddy paper often. The art is not of a really high standard. They're printed on presses that would be very much more difficult to use efficiently and effectively than a press today would be, a modern press or even a Victorian press. And so they're quite imperfect objects in many ways. They're not fine printing as it's practiced today, but they're still really evocative of their era, and they have a beauty that transcends that, occasionally scrappy quality. It can take me quite a while to get into the zone before I engrave, and then once I'm in the zone, the time can pass without me noticing. Particularly if I have the radio on, I can kind of engrave for 12 hours quite easily. You have to be in the right frame of mind to remember that what you are creating is not the finished object. It's a stamp from which the finished object will be made, and that's really critical to do in good engraving. When you've got to the end of the engraving process, you'll kind of feel like there's diminishing returns in terms of the changes you're making, because all of the kind of major bits of engraving are already done. And at that point, I would tend to do a proof just to see where it is. After that point, you can engrave the block more. It can be slightly frustrating to do that because initially when you're cutting it, you've blackened the surface of the block with kind of Indian ink or something, and you're cutting it away and you're seeing the wood color. So you effectively see what the print's going to look like. Once you've printed from it, generally speaking, you'll use a solvent or something that dilutes the ink, or you'll kind of use a rag to get it off the surface of the block. And that will push the ink into the recessed incisions where you've cut the surface of the block away. And it stains the wood color in those incisions. So you can no longer see the design staring back at you. It's more like just a black stained piece of wood. So generally you'd use something like talcum powder, just like put it on the surface of the block and kind of smooth it into the kind of incisions so that you can see where you're going again. But it's quite difficult to precisely maneuver a wood engraving tool back into a cut when you're kind of smearing talcum powder and stuff around it. So I tend to really take care to make sure that the initial print is as close as possible to the finished product, just because it is quite fiddly once you've printed from it to do a lot of work on the block. When I'm printing, I'll roll the ink out and get it onto the surface of the block using a rubber roller. And then I tend to print by hand at the moment. I also have printed using my press, but At the moment, because I don't have the press in London, I tend to print by hand a bit more. And I think it does give a really nice handmade quality, if you like. It's not necessarily quite so precise as printing in a press, but you can get really good results. And particularly, I find if you use a kind of thin Japanese paper like Tsunomi Sanaka or Kitakata, something like that, uh, you'll get a really decent print. Actually, I think I have published poetry in various places over the years. My output did drop quite a lot while I was doing more engraving, but I'm hoping over the next couple of years that I can rectify that, particularly as I'm spending more time on art generally, and I can combine them both and kind of up my output and hopefully publish more widely. Reading and writing poetry, I think, has been quite a big influence on me and my wood engraving. And I've always been a fan of wood engravers who are also poets and had that kind of interchange between the two forms. The experience of writing and the experience of doing wood engraving, they do have some similarities. Sometimes when you're working on a piece of formal writing, so it has like a meter or a verse form or a particular line, um, or when you're working on an engraving, when you're at one remove from the final product and you're working on a block of wood rather than the print that comes off it, there's always an element of surprise where the form, in the case of poetry, or the process, in the case of printmaking, almost collaborates with you, and you'll have an element of surprise and a lack of control almost, even if you try and be very kind of precise in turning out the finished product. And I always find that very rewarding to see the something click into place in a verse, or to see a print come off the block flipped and looking quite different to how you thought it would. So it's a really nice feeling. The people I read most tend to be modernist poets, people like Marianne Moore or Christopher Middleton. Really, I suppose, sometimes quite frustrating to the reader, as in they're offering a bit of resistance. It's not always the easiest reading experience, but they're interested in creating art forms that keep their secrets a little bit. Thing. Incorporating text and image is something I have done a bit, and I want to do more in my work. I really like the fact that when you include poetry in a piece of art, it's kind of has a life that is slightly outside the world of poetry, and particularly journals that are more specialist. You're kind of putting it on the wall. It's an immediate thing that can be accessed by other people, but it's still poetry. I do think that gives poetry another way of connecting with people. I have this kind of engraving of deer on the block, and along the top I'm going to have probably the first lines from a poem that I've written about the image, and then around the bottom I'll have the rest of the poem, and it goes along the top. It will be no doubt howls at the gate of the Duke who opens Parliament's Park, whose paling prongs are high and sharp, whose thistles are official. And then around the bottom I'll have, almost spoken in the deer's voice, making little oval beds, they give his grace, and yes, we minded our conscription less when an average man would call upon our beauty. Or, there might be a little bit of some changes to that text, but that's basically what I have planned for this one. Mistakes, unfortunately, they can happen when you're doing wood engraving. So generally, there's no way back. Once you've made a cut on the surface of the block, you're just going to have to work with it. And I tend not to start again, because generally there's so much time invested in a wood block. If you're going to start again after 20 hours, it's just dispiriting, really. In terms of the woods, the kind of luxury gold standard would be boxwood. Lemonwood, I find, which is kind of similar hardwood. It's a nice surface to work on, similarly dense, and it cuts really nicely. So I tend to use lemonwood for most projects, and then kind of pull out the boxwood wood for the kind of prestige ones, or the ones I'm really worried about, just because it's slightly easier to be precise on, and it's just more pleasurable to engrave. There are other woods that you can use as well, so you can use holly or pear. Maple, I think, is used quite a lot in the States. Part of the variety of the medium really is kind of using different woods and even synthetic plastic surfaces for different projects. Why did I choose wood engraving rather than woodcut? So the difference between those two methods is woodcuts are done on a plank of wood. So it's a plank is cut the same way that the tree is growing, if you like. Whereas wood engraving is end grain, so it's cut perpendicular to the direction that the tree is growing in. So you get typically a circular cross section, which would be the starting point for it. And when you engrave on end grain rather than kind of side grain planks, you can get a lot more detail into it. So I was always attracted to the detail you could achieve, and also the kind of intimacy with your subject. In terms of the tools, I think ideally you wouldn't have a preferred tool. I think there's some kind of saying that someone has recorded that ideally you would never have a tool in your hand long enough that it takes the warmth of your hand, because you want to be making the cut and selecting another one, and really just using the right tool for the right job. You really should sharpen your tools all the time. If you're doing wood engraving, it's just so they cut the wood so much better if you go back to them every kind of couple of hours at least, or more often actually, and just give them a sharpen on a sharpening stone. I say that fully in the knowledge that I'll go days without doing it myself, but once I've done it, I always notice the difference. So yeah, keep the tool sharp. Always use the tool that's slightly bigger than the one that you think you need, because black ink is, quite powerful. When you print from a wood block, often I tend to find it slightly overpowers the white cuts that you've made. So always reaching for a bigger tool than the one that you think you need is a good corrective to that. In terms of the inks, it's got to be oil-based, because if you use water-based inks to print from wood blocks, you'll open up the grain on the surface of the wood, and it's just not a good idea. So keep it to oil-based inks. I have used Cranfield ones. My favourite ones are a bit stiffer, so a bit more kind of tacky. It tends to be like, letterpress ink. Particularly, I like the slightly warmer blacks, so like Seville black, where there's a slightly orange tone to it, or conversely, I quite like a graphite kind of black, which is a bit more grey than standard carbon black letterpress ink. Knowing when to stop is obviously, there's a bit of experience worked into that. I generally tend to find out, if anything, I'll finish engraving a little bit too early potentially, or I'll be not sufficiently bold in the engraving, and things turn out a bit darker than I'd hoped and expected them to. So that's, I generally, if I err on that side, unfortunately. But I'm with experience, I'm getting slightly better at that. In terms of the wood engraving community, I'm a relatively new entrant. In fact, I wouldn't even necessarily say I know that many wood engravers, but all the ones I've met have been really generous, and kind of really welcoming, and willing to share their secrets. So there is a Society of Wood Engravers in the UK, and they tend to have exhibitions and events and so on. You can join if you're anything from an enthusiast to a kind of practicing full-time artist. You can join them, and many of their members will run courses and so on. Whilst I wouldn't say they are all very similar people, probably the kind of person who voluntarily sits for 50 hours at a desk, they probably have common character traits of kind of assiduity and kind of endless concentration, so on. There was a writer on wood engraving called John Jackson, who was an apprentice of Buick's, so kind of training in the early 19th century, who said that there was something about the medium that tended to run to madness almost because of the level of concentration that you need, and advised people with sensitive sons, I think he said, not to apprentice them to that trade and to send them into something a little bit less full on in terms of the concentration required.